In the windswept plains of rural Wyoming, a desperate Vegas enforcer was about to make the biggest mistake of his criminal career. What seemed like a simple truck theft in the dead of night turned deadly when Damon Cruz discovered the cherry red Ford F-100 belonged to more than just another rancher. Seagal wasn't your typical Wyoming horse breeder. For over 2 decades, he was a decorated Special Forces operative and martial arts expert, known for neutralizing threats with surgical precision before they knew what hit them. When Cruz pulled his knife and threatened violence to steal the vintage pickup, he had no idea he was facing a lethal weapon disguised as a humble rancher. Seagal emerged from the shadows on horseback like a ghost rider from the Old West, bringing skills that would transform a petty theft into a life-altering confrontation. What began as a desperate man's grab for freedom would become a test of redemption versus retribution. The quiet ranch in Riverton would never be the same after the night a city predator learned that some farmers bite back harder than any urban jungle ever could. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming highway stretched endlessly before Damon Cruz like a faded ribbon across the high plains, broken only by the occasional fence post or weathered barn that marked another failing ranch. His stolen rental car coughed and wheezed as it crested another hill, the engine temperature gauge hovering dangerously close to the red zone. 3 days of driving straight through from Vegas had taken its toll on both man and machine. Damon's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles still split and scabbed from the collection job that had gone sideways. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy Marconi's face twisted in shock as the blood pooled beneath him on the casino floor. It was supposed to be simple intimidation, nothing more, but Tommy had reached for something in his jacket and instinct had taken over. Now Tommy was in intensive care and Damon was running from everyone who wanted him dead or behind bars. The sign ahead read, Riverton, population 847, in faded green letters, and Damon felt his chest tighten. Small towns meant curious eyes, people who remembered faces, locals who could spot trouble from a mile away. But the gas gauge was hovering near empty, and the radiator was making sounds that suggested complete failure was imminent. He didn't have a choice. He pulled into Murphy's gas station, a weathered building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The attendant, a grizzled man in coveralls, emerged from the office with the unhurried pace of someone who'd never needed to run from anything in his life. Damon handed over crumpled 20 stolen from a truck stop 3 states back, avoiding eye contact while the man filled his tank. Passing through, the attendant asked, his voice carrying that particular brand of Western friendliness that felt more like an interrogation. Yeah, Damon muttered, pulling his baseball cap lower over his eyes. Just heading north. The attendant nodded, but Damon could feel the man's eyes cataloging details: the split lip, the nervous energy, the way Damon's clothes hung loose like he'd been wearing them for days without changing. When the tank was full, Damon climbed back into the car and pulled away, but not before catching the attendant writing something down on a pad of paper. Damn small towns, he thought, driving slowly through Riverton's main street. Everything here moved at a different pace: cowboys in worn jeans walking their horses down dirt roads, families sitting on front porches watching the world go by, kids playing in yards without fences. It was like stepping back in time, and it made Damon's skin crawl. He was a creature of neon lights and concrete, of quick scores and quicker exits. This place felt like a trap. He was about to drive straight through when he spotted it parked next to a feed store, a cherry red pickup truck that looked like it had been pulled straight from a classic car magazine. A 1967 Ford F-100, he realized, its chrome bumper gleaming in the afternoon sun. The paint job was immaculate, the kind of restoration that cost serious money and took serious time. But more importantly, it looked fast and reliable, exactly what he needed to put more distance between himself and the people hunting him. Damon pulled over and watched as a young woman with sun-streaked hair loaded feed sacks into the truck's bed. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been doing ranch work her whole life, her movements efficient and practiced. When she finished, she climbed into the cab and drove away, but not before Damon caught the license plate number and memorized the direction she'd headed. He followed at a distance, keeping well back as the red truck turned onto a dirt road that led toward the Wind River Range. The landscape here was different from the flat plains he'd been driving through, rolling hills dotted with cattle, vast stretches of grassland that seemed to go on forever. The truck eventually turned into a long driveway marked by a simple wooden sign that read Seagal Ranch. Damon parked behind a copse of cottonwoods and studied the property through binoculars he'd stolen from the glove compartment. The main house was a sprawling log structure that looked like it had been built to last, with a wraparound porch and windows that gazed out over the valley. The barn was massive, painted red with white trim, and he could see horses grazing in the pasture beyond. But it was the red truck, now parked beside the barn, that held his attention. He watched the routine for the rest of the afternoon. The young woman he'd seen earlier was joined by an older man who moved with a quiet, measured grace that seemed almost out of place on a working ranch. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to notice everything around him without appearing to look, that made Damon's instincts twitch. But desperation was stronger than caution, and that truck represented his best chance of getting far enough away to disappear completely. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Damon made his decision. He would come back after dark, when the ranch was quiet and the family was asleep. The truck would be easy enough to steal. He'd been boosting cars since he was 15, and an old Ford wouldn't have the sophisticated security systems of newer vehicles. By morning, he'd be hundreds of miles away, and the good people of Riverton would have nothing but tire tracks to remember him by. He drove back to town and checked into a motel that looked like it had seen better decades, paying cash and signing a fake name in the register. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant, but it was clean enough, and more importantly, it was anonymous. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy Marconi's face and heard the sound of approaching sirens. The walls seemed to close in around him, and he found himself pacing the small room like a caged animal. At midnight, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The knife in his pocket felt heavy against his leg, a familiar weight that had gotten him out of trouble more times than he could count. Tonight, it would help him get the truck, and tomorrow he'd be free. At least, that's what he told himself as he drove back toward the Seagal Ranch, unaware that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The moon hung low and pale over the Wyoming landscape, casting long shadows across the Seagal Ranch. As Damon Cruz crept through the darkness toward the red pickup truck, he'd parked his stolen rental car a half-mile away, hidden behind an abandoned grain silo, and approached the ranch on foot through the sagebrush and buffalo grass. The night air was sharp and thin, carrying the scent of hay and horses and something else he couldn't identify, something that spoke of wide-open spaces and clean living. Every instinct he'd developed during 15 years of petty crime told him this was too easy. The truck sat unguarded beside the barn, keys probably hanging right inside the unlocked house like some Norman Rockwell painting. But desperation had a way of drowning out caution, and Damon needed that truck more than he needed to listen to his better judgment. He slipped through the fence rails, careful not to let the wood creak under his weight. The main house was dark, except for a single window on the second floor, and he could hear the distant sound of a television playing somewhere inside. A dog barked once from the direction of the neighbor's property, but it was far enough away not to be a concern. Everything was going according to plan. The truck's door handle turned easily in his hand, and he slipped inside, feeling for the ignition. No keys, but that was expected. He pulled a screwdriver from his jacket pocket and positioned it against the steering column, preparing to hotwire the ignition the way he'd learned in juvenile detention. The familiar ritual was almost comforting, a reminder of simpler times when his biggest worry was avoiding the cops for a few hours. That's when he heard a soft snort from somewhere nearby, followed by the sound of hooves shifting in the dirt. He froze, one hand on the screwdriver, the other reaching instinctively for the knife in his pocket. Slowly, he turned toward the sound and found himself staring at a magnificent Mustang gelding, its coat gleaming silver in the moonlight. The horse stood maybe 20 feet away, watching him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through him. "Easy, boy," Damon whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. The animal snorted again, but didn't move, as if it was waiting for something or someone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Damon's blood run cold. He spun around, knife already in his hand, expecting to see a ranch hand or maybe a neighbor who'd heard something suspicious. Instead, he found himself face to face with a sight that defied everything he thought he knew about rural Wyoming. Steven Seagal sat astride a black gelding, emerging from the shadows near the barn like something out of an old Western movie. Even in the dim moonlight, there was no mistaking the weathered face, the long silver hair, the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. He wore a simple denim shirt and jeans, but there was something about the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to fill the space around him without effort, that made Damon's throat go dry. "You picked the wrong truck," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. There was no anger in it, no fear, just a statement of fact delivered with the calm certainty of someone who'd seen it all before. Damon's hand tightened around the knife handle, and he brandished it like a talisman against the quiet menace radiating from the man on horseback. "Stay back, old man," he snarled, trying to inject some of his old Vegas swagger into his voice. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you make me." Seagal dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. The horse he'd been riding stood perfectly still, as if waiting for orders, while the Mustang moved closer to his master's side. "No," Seagal said simply, "you won't." There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that made Damon's confidence evaporate like morning mist. He'd spent his whole life reading people, learning to spot weakness and exploit it, but this man gave him nothing to work with. No fear, no anger, no uncertainty, just a calm, implacable presence that seemed to fill the entire ranch yard. "I'm not playing games," Damon said, taking a step forward and waving the knife in what he hoped was a threatening manner. "I need that truck, and I'm taking it. Walk away now, and nobody gets hurt." Seagal moved then, not quickly, but with the inexorable certainty of a river flowing downhill. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was close enough to touch, his hand moving in a casual gesture that Damon's "I couldn't quite follow." The knife went flying from his grip, clattering against the barn wall, and suddenly Damon found himself spun around, his arm twisted behind his back in a joint lock that sent lightning bolts of pain up his shoulder. "Easy," Seagal said, his voice still calm, still quiet. "Don't fight it. You'll only hurt yourself." Damon tried to struggle, tried to break free using the dirty fighting techniques he'd learned on the streets of East LA, but it was like trying to fight the tide. Every movement he made only tightened the lock, sending fresh waves of agony through his shoulder and wrist. In desperation, he threw his head back, trying to catch Seagal in the face, but the older man simply shifted his weight and Damon found himself face first in the dirt, eating Wyoming soil while his arm was twisted at an angle that made him see stars. "You done?" Seagal asked, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. "Yeah," Damon gasped, his voice muffled by the ground. "Yeah, I'm done." The pressure disappeared, and Damon found himself pulled to his feet with the same gentle efficiency that had put him down. His shoulder throbbed, his pride was in tatters, and his carefully laid plans were scattered like leaves in a windstorm. He stood there swaying slightly, looking up at a man who could have broken him in half without breathing hard, and waited for the beating that was sure to come. Instead, Seagal dusted off his hands and walked over to where the knife had fallen. He picked it up, examined it for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. "You hungry?" he asked, as if they'd just been introduced at a church social. "There's coffee inside." Damon stared at him, wondering if the joint lock had somehow affected his hearing. "What? Coffee?" Seagal repeated patiently. "Maybe some leftover stew. You look like you haven't eaten in a while." The kindness in his voice was somehow more disorienting than the violence had been. Damon had been prepared for anger, for retribution, for the kind of brutality he'd come to expect from the world. But this quiet offer of hospitality left him completely off balance, unsure of how to respond or what was expected of him. "I don't understand," he said finally. Seagal was already walking toward the house, the two horses following him like well-trained dogs. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "We'll figure it out." The interior of the Seagal farmhouse was nothing like what Damon had expected. Instead of the rustic simplicity he'd imagined, he found himself in a warm, lived-in space that spoke. of quiet prosperity and careful attention to detail. Native American artwork hung on the walls alongside family photographs, and the furniture was a comfortable mix of leather and wood that invited you to sit and stay a while. The kitchen, visible through an archway, gleamed with stainless steel appliances and granite countertops that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Las Vegas penthouse. But it was the woman standing beside the kitchen island, a pump-action shotgun, cradled casually in her arms, that commanded Damon's immediate attention. She was probably in her late 20s, with the kind of natural beauty that came from outdoor work and clean living, but her green eyes held a hardness that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Lila," Seagal said by way of introduction. "This is our visitor. He was admiring your truck." "I'll bet he was," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Western drawl that might have been charming under different circumstances. Her finger wasn't on the trigger, but it wasn't far away either. "Should I call Sheriff Ridley?" "Not yet," Seagal said, moving to the coffee maker and pulling down 2 mugs from a cabinet. "Let's see what he has to say for himself first." Damon stood just inside the doorway, acutely aware of the dirt on his clothes and the blood on his knuckles. The warmth of the house was almost overwhelming after days of cheap motels and gas station bathrooms, and he found himself fighting the urge to sit down in one of the comfortable-looking chairs. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be halfway to Montana by now, not standing in some rancher's kitchen being offered coffee by a man who should have beaten him senseless. "I don't want any trouble," he said finally, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "I just need to keep moving." "Where to?" Seagal asked, pouring coffee into both mugs. The aroma filled the kitchen, rich and strong, and Damon's stomach growled in response. When had he last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? "North," Damon said vaguely. "Just north." Lila snorted. "That's specific. What's north? Family? Work? Or are you just planning to drive until you hit Canada?" There was something in her tone, a mixture of skepticism and genuine curiosity, that made Damon's defenses go up. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you people are playing, but I'm not interested. I tried to steal your truck, your dad there kicked my ass, and now I'm leaving. End of story." "Dad?" Lila's eyebrows went up, and she shot an amused look at Seagal. "Steven's not my father. He's my ex-husband." The correction hit Damon like a physical blow. Ex-husband. Which meant this woman had been married to the man who'd just demonstrated he could tie him in knots without breaking a sweat. It also meant the dynamic in the room was more complicated than he'd realized, and complicated was the last thing he needed right now. "Coffee's ready," Seagal said, offering one of the mugs to Damon. "Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over." Damon wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but his legs were shaking and the coffee smelled like heaven. He took the mug with hands that trembled slightly, cursing himself for showing weakness, and lowered himself into one of the kitchen chairs. The coffee was perfect strong without being bitter, with just a hint of sweetness that spoke of someone who knew how to make a proper cup. "When's the last time you slept?" Seagal asked, settling into the chair across from him. "I mean really. Slept, not just dozed off in your car." "I don't know," Damon admitted. "Few days, maybe. I've been driving." "From where?" The question hung in the air between them, and Damon felt the weight of it like a stone in his chest. Everything he'd been running from was contained in that simple inquiry: Las Vegas, Tommy Marconi, the collection job that had gone wrong, the men who wanted him dead. But something about the quiet way Seagal asked it, the lack of judgment in his voice, made the truth want to come pouring out. "Vegas," he said finally. "I had some trouble there." "What kind of trouble?" Damon took another sip of coffee, buying time. "The kind that follows you. The kind that doesn't forgive." The phone rang then, sharp and insistent in the quiet kitchen. Lila answered it, her voice taking on a different tone as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. "Sheriff Ridley," she said, covering the mouthpiece. "Says there's been some reports of a suspicious character in town. Wants to know if we've seen anything." Seagal held out his hand for the phone, and Damon tensed, ready to bolt for the door. But instead of describing the man sitting at his kitchen table, Seagal simply said, "Evening, Mark. No, haven't seen anyone suspicious. Just a traveler who needed some coffee and a place to sit for a few minutes." He paused, listening. "Yeah, I'll keep an eye out. Thanks for the heads up." He hung up and looked at Damon with those unervingly calm eyes. Sheriffs got reports of a man asking questions about stolen cars. Seems someone's been very interested in finding you. The coffee turned to ash in Damon's mouth. They found me. Not yet, Seagal said. But they're close, which means you've got a choice to make. You can run and probably get caught before you reach the county line. Or you can stay here tonight, get some real food and some real sleep, and figure out what you're really running from. I know what I'm running from, Damon said. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was true. Was he running from the men who wanted him dead? From the police who wanted him in prison? Or from something deeper, something that had been chasing him long before he'd ever heard of Tommy Marconi? Do you? Seagal asked quietly. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're running from yourself. And that's a race you can't win. Lila had put the shotgun aside and was moving around the kitchen, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator and pantry. I'm making some sandwiches, she said without looking at either of them. You look like you could use some food. The simple act of kindness hit Damon harder than any physical blow could have. When was the last time someone had made him food? When was the last time someone had offered him shelter without expecting something in return? He found himself blinking back tears, and he turned his face away, not wanting them to see his weakness. Why are you helping me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Seagal was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. Because someone helped me once, he said finally, when I was running from something I thought I couldn't face. And because everyone deserves a chance to stop running, even if they don't think they do. The bunkhouse is clean, Lila said, setting a plate of sandwiches on the table. There's a shower and clean clothes if you want them. In the morning, we'll see if you're still so eager to run. Damon looked at the food, at the woman who'd been ready to shoot him 10 minutes ago now offering him shelter, at the man who'd disarmed him with deadly efficiency now talking about second chances. It was all too much, too fast, too different from the world he'd known. But his body was making the decision for him, exhaustion and hunger overriding his caution. Just for the night, he said. Just for the night, Seagal agreed. And then we'll see what tomorrow brings. Dawn came early to the Wyoming high country, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to go on forever. Damon woke to the sound of someone knocking on the bunkhouse door, his body protesting as he rolled out of the narrow bed. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, and then it all came flooding back: the failed theft, the impossible man on horseback, the offer of shelter that had seemed too good to be true. Rise and shine, came Steven Seagal's voice from outside the door. Daylight's burning. Damon stumbled to the door, still wearing the clothes he'd slept in, and found Seagal standing on the small porch with a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. The older man looked like he'd been up for hours, his silver hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, his clothes clean and pressed despite the early hour. What time is it? Damon asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. 5:30, Seagal replied. We start early around here. Plenty of work to be done before the heat hits. Damon blinked, trying to process this information. Work? You want to eat, you work. House rules. Seagal's tone was matter of fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. There's gear in the barn that should fit you. We'll start with the horses. The barn was a cathedral of weathered wood and sweet-smelling hay, with shafts of golden light streaming through the gaps in the boards. Damon found himself face to face with a dozen horses, all of them watching him with the kind of patient intelligence that made him uncomfortable. He'd grown up in the city, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional stray cat, and these massive animals seemed almost alien to him. This is Zephyr, Seagal said, approaching the silver Mustang Damon had seen the night before. The horse nickered softly and nuzzled Seagal's shoulder with obvious affection. He's particular about who he lets near him. Took me 6 months to earn his trust. He's beautiful, Damon said, and meant it. Even with his limited knowledge of horses, he could see that this animal was something special. He's a survivor, Seagal said quietly. Spent his first 5 years running wild in the mountains. Takes one to know one, I guess. The work began simply enough: mucking out stalls, replacing dirty hay with fresh bedding, filling water troughs. But what seemed like straightforward labor quickly became an exercise in frustration. The horses seemed to sense his inexperience, stepping on his feet and shouldering past him with casual indifference. The hay was heavier than it looked, and the mucking fork felt clumsy in his hands. designed for someone who'd been doing this work their whole life. "You're fighting it," came a gravelly voice from behind him. Damon turned to see an elderly man, watching him with obvious amusement. He was maybe 70, with skin like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. "The horse knows you're scared, and scared people make horses nervous." "I'm not scared," Damon said, then immediately proved himself wrong by jumping back as the mare in the stall turned to look at him. "Name's Buck," the old man said, extending a calloused hand. "I run this place when Steven's not around, which is most of the time these days." "Damon," he replied, shaking the offered hand and trying not to wince at the man's grip. "I know who you are," Buck said, his tone neutral but his eyes hard. "Question is, what are you still doing here?" It was a fair question, and one Damon had been asking himself since he'd woken up. By all rights, he should have been gone hours ago, putting miles between himself and the people who were hunting him. But something about this place, about the quiet routine of morning chores and the patient way Seagal had shown him how to properly handle a pitchfork, made him reluctant to leave. "Steven asked me to stay," he said finally. "Steven asks a lot of people to stay," Buck replied. "Most of them aren't worth the trouble. We'll see which kind you are." The old man's skepticism was like a physical weight, but Damon found himself determined to prove him wrong. He threw himself into the work with renewed energy, ignoring the blisters forming on his hands and the ache in his back. By the time Lila appeared with lunch, he was filthy and exhausted, but he'd managed to muck out 6 stalls without being stepped on. "You look like hell," she said, but there was something like approval in her voice. "Feel like it too," Damon admitted, accepting the sandwich she offered. "How do you people do this every day?" "Practice," she said simply, "and the knowledge that the animals depend on us. Horses don't care if you're tired or sore or having a bad day. They just need to be fed and watered and kept safe." After lunch, Seagal put him to work repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. The work was different from the morning's chores, more technical, requiring attention to detail and a basic understanding of how things fit together. But it was also oddly satisfying, the kind of labor that engaged both his hands and his mind. "You've done this before," Seagal observed, watching Damon string wire between 2 posts. "Some," Damon said. "Had a job with a contractor in LA for a while, before things went south. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "What happened?" Damon's hands stilled on the wire. "The usual. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong crowd. Story of my life." "Doesn't have to be," Seagal said quietly. "Stories can change. Sometimes they have to." They worked in companionable silence. For the rest of the afternoon, the rhythm of physical labor gradually easing the tension that had been riding Damon's shoulders for days. There was something about working with his hands, about creating something useful and solid, that quieted the constant chatter in his head. For the first time since Vegas, he found himself thinking about something other than the men who wanted him dead. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Damon realized something that surprised him. He wasn't thinking about running anymore. The idea of getting back in his stolen car and driving north through the night no longer seemed like salvation. It seemed like giving up. "Stay another day," Seagal said, as if reading his thoughts. "Help me mend the south fence. There's more wire that needs stringing." Damon looked at the fence they'd repaired, at the neat rows of wire and the solid posts that would keep the horses safe. Tomorrow there would be more work, more chances to prove himself, more opportunities to do something useful instead of just surviving. "Okay," he said, surprising himself with the decision. "One more day." But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't be just one more day. Something was happening to him here, something he didn't fully understand. The constant fear was still there, the knowledge that dangerous men were looking for him, but it was balanced now by something else. A sense of purpose, maybe, or just the simple satisfaction of a job well done. That night, as he lay in the narrow bunk listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, Damon found himself thinking about Zephyr, the silver Mustang who'd spent his first years running wild. Seagal had said it took one to know one. And maybe that was true. Maybe some things were worth the risk of standing still for. The morning of Damon's 3rd day on the ranch dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds building over the Wind River Range like an approaching army. The air carried the sharp bite of an incoming storm, and even the horses seemed restless, their ears constantly swiveling toward the horizon. Buck emerged from the barn as Damon finished his coffee, carrying a toolbox and wearing the kind of grim expression that suggested the day wasn't going to be pleasant. "South fence needs major work," the old man announced, jerking his head toward the distant pasture. "Tree came down in the spring, took out 40 yards of fencing. Been putting it off too long." Damon nodded, pulling on the work gloves Lila had found for him. His hands were already developing calluses, and the constant ache in his shoulders from unaccustomed labor was becoming familiar. There was something oddly comforting about the routine of physical work, the way it left no room for the anxious thoughts that had plagued him for weeks. The damaged fence was worse than Buck had described. The fallen cottonwood had crushed not just the wire but several of the posts, creating a gap large enough for the horses to wander through if they were so inclined. It would take hours to clear the debris and string new wire, work that required patience and precision. "You ever do this kind of work before coming here?" Buck asked as they began cutting away the tangled wire with heavy snips. "Some," Damon replied, concentrating on making clean cuts. "Construction, mostly. Odd jobs." "Uh-huh." Buck's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "And before that?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Damon had been dreading this moment, when someone would start digging into his past with more than casual curiosity. But there was something about Buck's direct manner, the way he asked the question without judgment but with clear expectation of an honest answer, that made evasion seem pointless. "Before that, I made bad choices," Damon said finally. "We all make bad choices," Buck replied, his hands never stopping their methodical work. "Question is whether you learn from them or keep making the same ones over and over." They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of their labor creating its own conversation. Damon found himself stealing glances at the older man, trying to read the weathered face for signs of condemnation or acceptance. Buck's expression remained neutral, focused on the task at hand, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was far from finished with his questions. "Steven tells me you're running from some people," Buck said eventually, his voice casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. Maybe. Buck straightened up, fixing Damon with a look that would have been intimidating even without the sharp wire cutters in his hands. "Son, there's no maybe about it. You got the look of a man who's been running hard and expecting to keep running. Question is, what from?" Damon's hands stilled on the wire. The smart thing would be to deflect, to give Buck the same vague answers he'd been giving everyone else. But something about the old man's direct gaze and the memory of Steven's unexpected kindness made him want to tell the truth, even if it meant admitting things he'd rather forget. "I work collections in Vegas," he said quietly. "For some people who don't like to take no for an answer. Last job went wrong, and now everybody wants me dead." "Collections," Buck repeated, his tone flat. "That's a fancy way of saying you broke people's legs for money." The words hit Damon like a physical blow, partly because of their bluntness, but mostly because they were true. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he said, but even as he said it, he knew how weak it sounded. "But it was like that," Buck pressed, his voice hardening. "And now you're here, bringing your trouble to good people who don't deserve it." Something snapped inside Damon then, all the frustration and fear and self-loathing of the past weeks boiling over in a rush of anger. "You think I don't know that?" he snarled, throwing down his wire cutters and taking a step toward the older man. "You think I wanted this? You think I chose to be running scared, sleeping in my car, looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes? I think you made choices," Buck replied calmly, not backing down despite the 20-year age difference between them. "And I think you're still making them. Every minute you stay here, you're choosing to put Steven and Lila at risk." "They asked me to stay." "Steven asked you to stay?" Buck corrected. "Steven who sees broken things and thinks he can fix them. Steven who spent 20 years fighting other people's wars and now thinks he can save every lost soul who wanders onto his property." The words stung because there was truth in them. Damon could see it now, the pattern Buck was describing. Steven Seagal, the warrior turned rancher, trying to redeem himself by redeeming others. And Damon was just the latest project, another broken thing to be fixed. "You don't know anything about me," Damon said, but his voice had lost its heat. "I know you're soft," Buck shot back. "City soft. I know you've never done an honest day's work in your life until you got here. And I know that the kind of men who come looking for people like you don't care who gets hurt in the process. People like me? The anger flared again, hot and defensive. What's that supposed to mean? Trash, Buck said simply. Human trash that brings nothing but trouble wherever it goes. That was too much. Damon lunged forward, his fist aimed at the old man's weathered face, but before he could make contact, a strong hand clamped down on his wrist, stopping him cold. He spun around to find Seagal standing behind him, having approached with the same silent grace he'd displayed the night they'd first met. Easy, Steven said quietly, his grip firm but not painful. Both of you. There was something in his voice, a quality of absolute authority that cut through Damon's rage like a blade. He found himself stepping back, his breathing ragged, while Buck straightened his shirt and picked up his wire cutters as if nothing had happened. Buck's got a right to his concerns, Steven continued, his eyes moving between the two men. And you've got a right to be angry. But anger's not going to fix this fence or solve your problems. Your friend here thinks I'm trash, Damon said, his voice still shaking with residual fury. Buck lost a son to gang violence in Denver, Steven replied calmly. Forgive him if he's not immediately welcoming to someone who used to make a living hurting people. The words hit Damon like a bucket of cold water. He looked at Buck, seeing the old man's antagonism in a new light, and felt something inside him deflate. How many families had he destroyed during his years in Vegas? How many fathers had grieved because of choices he'd made? I never killed anyone, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure why that mattered. But you hurt people, Steven said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Damon admitted. I hurt people. They stood there in the growing wind, 3 men surrounded by tangled wire and the detritus of the storm-felled tree. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the mountains, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter the dusty ground. The question now, Steven said, is what you're going to do about it. I can't undo what I did, Damon replied. No, Steven agreed. But you can choose what you do next. You can keep running, keep looking over your shoulder, keep expecting the worst from yourself and everyone else. Or you can stop running and start building something better. And if those men find me here, what happens to you and Lila then? Steven's smile was grim, but not without warmth. Let me worry about that. I've been dealing with dangerous men, longer than you've been alive. The rain began in earnest then, driving them toward the barn for shelter. As they gathered their tools and prepared to make a run for it, Buck caught Damon's arm. I lost my boy to people like you used to be, he said quietly. But Steven's right, you don't have to keep being that person. Just don't expect it to be easy, and don't expect everyone to welcome you with open arms. Damon nodded, understanding. I'm sorry about your son. Buck studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once. We'll see if you mean that. As they ran through the rain toward the barn, Damon found himself thinking about choices, about the roads taken and not taken that had led him to this moment. For the first time since Vegas, he was beginning to understand that running might not be the answer, but stopping, staying, trying to build something better that terrified him more than any collection job ever had. The storm passed during the night, leaving the ranch washed clean and gleaming under a carpet of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. Damon couldn't sleep despite the exhaustion that sat heavy in his bones. The confrontation with Buck had stirred up emotions he'd spent years trying to bury, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces people he'd intimidated, hurt, terrorized in service of men who thought violence was just another business expense. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and stepped out of the bunkhouse onto the small covered porch. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wet sage and something else, something wild and free that spoke of vast open spaces and endless sky. In the distance, he could hear the soft sounds of the horses moving in their pasture, and on impulse, he decided to walk down and check on them. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light that transformed the familiar ranch into something magical and strange. As he approached the fence line, several of the horses lifted their heads to watch him, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like dark mirrors. They didn't seem alarmed by his presence, just curious, and he found their calm acceptance oddly comforting. But it was Zephyr who drew his attention, the silver Mustang standing apart from the others near the far corner of the pasture. Even in the moonlight, There was something magnificent about the animal, something that spoke of freedom and wildness barely contained. Stephen had said it took 6 months to earn the horse's trust, and looking at him now, Damon could understand. Why? Hey, boy, he said softly, approaching the fence with slow, careful movements. Can't sleep either? Zephyr's ears swiveled toward him, and the horse took a few steps closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, a kind of awareness that made Damon feel like he was being evaluated and found either worthy or wanting. I know how you feel, Damon continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Being somewhere new, not sure if you can trust the people around you, wondering if you should run or stay. The horse snorted softly, a sound that might have been agreement or dismissal. But he took another step closer, now close enough that Damon could see the scars that crisscrossed his hide, evidence of his years running wild in the mountains, fighting predators and the elements and other horses for survival. Stephen says you're a survivor, Damon said. Says it takes one to know one. I guess we're both trying to figure out what comes after surviving. Huh? Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand toward the fence, palm up, letting Zephyr decide whether to accept the gesture. For a long moment, the horse simply stood there, nostrils flaring as he tested Damon's scent. Then, with deliberate grace, he stepped forward and touched his nose to Damon's palm. The contact was electric, a moment of connection that transcended the barriers of species and circumstance. Zephyr's breath was warm against his skin, and Damon could feel the power in the animal, the controlled strength that could have easily hurt him but chose instead to trust. You're beautiful, Damon whispered, moving his hand slowly up to stroke the horse's neck. Zephyr allowed the touch, even leaning into it slightly, and Damon felt something inside his chest loosen and expand. When was the last time anything had trusted him? When was the last time he'd been trusted with something precious and fragile? They stood there together in the moonlight, man and horse, both refugees from their former lives, both learning to navigate a world that offered kindness instead of cruelty. Damon found himself talking to the animal, words spilling out in a whisper that carried his fears and hopes and the growing certainty that he was changing, becoming something different from what he'd been. I used to hurt people, he said, his hand moving in slow strokes along Zephyr's neck. I was good at it too. Knew just how much pressure to apply, just where to hit to make someone compliant without doing permanent damage. Thought I was smart, thought I was in control. But I was just running, just like you were running in those mountains. Running from everything I could have been, everything I was afraid to try to become. Zephyr nickered softly, a sound that might have been understanding or sympathy. In the distance, an owl called from the cottonwoods along the creek, and the wind rustled through the grass with a sound like whispered secrets. Stephen thinks I can change, Damon continued. Buck thinks I'm just trash that'll bring trouble. Down on good people. Maybe we're both right. Maybe I am trash, but maybe trash can be recycled into something useful if you're willing to do the work. From the shadows near the barn, Seagal watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. He'd been checking on a mare who'd seemed off her feed earlier, and the sight of Damon connecting with Zephyr confirmed what he'd hoped to see. Trust was a precious commodity, not easily given or received, and the fact that his most skittish horse was allowing a stranger to touch him spoke volumes about the kind of man Damon could become. Stephen had seen enough broken men to recognize the signs, the haunted look in the eyes, the way they carried themselves as if expecting a blow, the protective walls they built around their hearts. Some could be reached, helped to find a different path. Others were too far gone, too damaged by their choices and circumstances to ever find their way back to anything resembling peace. But watching Damon with Zephyr, seeing the gentleness in his touch and hearing the soft murmur of his voice, Stephen felt cautiously optimistic. There was good in this young man, buried under layers of anger and self-loathing, but still there, still capable of growth. The question was whether Damon would choose to nurture that goodness or let it wither and die. Up at the house, Lila stood at her bedroom window, also watching the scene in the pasture. She'd been skeptical of her ex-husband's decision to harbor a fugitive, worried about the danger it might bring to their doorstep. But seeing Damon with Zephyr, witnessing the patience and care he showed the traumatized animal, she felt her resistance beginning to soften. There was something about the way he moved, the careful deliberation of his gestures, that reminded her of Stephen when he'd first started working with rescued horses. The same wounded recognition, the same understanding that trust was earned in inches, not miles. Maybe Stephen was right. Maybe this man was worth the risk. As the night deepened, Damon finally stepped back from the fence, his hand trailing along Zephyr's neck one last time. "Thanks for listening," he said softly. "Maybe tomorrow you'll let me brush you down. Give you some of those carrots I saw Lila feeding the others." Zephyr snorted and tossed his head, then moved away with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. But as Damon turned to walk back to the bunkhouse, the horse followed him along the fence line, a silent companion keeping pace in the moonlight. For the first time since Vegas, Damon felt something that might have been hope-stirring. In his chest, it was fragile and uncertain, like a flame in the wind, but it was there. Maybe he could change. Maybe he could become someone worthy of the trust Zephyr had shown him. Maybe the running could finally stop. As he reached the bunkhouse, he turned. For one last look at the pasture, Zephyr stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, watching him with those intelligent eyes. In the distance, a coyote called from the hills, wild and free, and Damon understood that there were different kinds of freedom. The kind that came from running, and the kind that came from choosing to stay and face what you'd been running from. Tonight, for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand the difference. The next morning brought Sheriff Mark Ridley to the ranch, his patrol car raising a plume of dust as it wound up the long driveway. Damon saw him coming from the barn where he'd been cleaning Zephyr's stall, and his first instinct was to run. Every muscle in his body tensed, and he found himself calculating distances to cover, escape routes through the surrounding hills, how long it would take to reach his hidden car. But something made him stay, perhaps the memory of Zephyr's trust the night before, or Stephen's quiet certainty that running wasn't the answer. Sheriff Ridley was exactly what Damon had expected from a small-town lawman, tall, weathered, with the kind of steady gaze that missed nothing. He wore his authority comfortably, like a well-broken-in pair of boots, and when he stepped out of his patrol car, his hand didn't go to his weapon, but it wasn't far away either. "Morning, Stephen," he said, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of old friendship. "Heard you might have a visitor I should meet." Stephen emerged from the house, coffee mug in hand, moving with that same unhurried grace that had become so familiar to Damon. "Mark," he said by way of greeting, "thanks for giving me the time I asked for." "Time's up," Ridley replied, but not unkindly. "Had some interesting calls yesterday. Seems there are some people from Nevada very interested in finding a man matching your visitor's description. Professional interest, if you catch my meaning." Damon felt his mouth go dry. They'd found him, just as he'd known they would. The only question now was whether he'd leave in handcuffs or in a body bag. "What kind of professionals?" Stephen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The kind that carry business cards with no names on them," Ridley said grimly. "The kind that ask questions first and let other people worry about the constitutional niceties. They'll be here by tomorrow, maybe sooner." Lila appeared on the porch, her face pale but determined. "Can't you just tell them he's not here?" "I could," Ridley agreed. "But they're not the type to take my word for it. And when they don't find him here, they'll start looking elsewhere. Might decide to have conversations with the locals, see if anyone's seen anything. Could get unpleasant for a lot of innocent people." The weight of those words settled over Damon like a lead blanket. It wasn't just about him anymore. His presence here was putting everyone at risk: Stephen, Lila, Buck, even people in town who'd done nothing more than serve him coffee or sell him gas. The smart thing, the right thing, would be to get in his car and drive away, lead the hunters. Somewhere else where innocent people wouldn't get caught in the crossfire. "So what are my options?" Damon asked, stepping out of the barn to face whatever was coming. Ridley studied him for a long moment, taking in the work clothes, the calloused hands, the way he stood straight instead of hunching his shoulders like a guilty man. "Well," he said finally, "I could arrest you right now. Grand theft auto, fleeing to avoid prosecution, probably a dozen other charges if I cared to dig deep enough. You'd be in county lockup by noon, and these Nevada boys would have to go through proper channels to get at you." "And the other option?" Stephen asked. "The other option is he runs," Ridley said bluntly. "Gets in that stolen car of his and drives as far and fast as he can. Maybe he makes it across the border, maybe he doesn't. Either way, it becomes someone else's problem." Damon found himself looking at Zephyr, who had wandered over to the fence and was watching the proceedings. With intelligent eyes, the horse had spent years running wild, surviving on his own, trusting no one. But eventually, he'd chosen to accept Stephen's offer of safety and care. The question was whether Damon had the courage to make the same choice. "There's a third option," Stephen said quietly. Ridley raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "Community service. Court-supervised probation. He stays here, works on the ranch, pays his debt to society through honest labor instead of sitting in a cell." "Stephen," Ridley said, his tone carrying a note of warning. "This isn't some kid who got caught joyriding. This man is wanted by some very dangerous people." "Dangerous people who have no legal standing in Wyoming," Stephen replied calmly. "And no right to interfere with the administration of justice in your county." Damon could see the wheels turning in the sheriff's mind, weighing the risks and benefits of each option. It was clear that Ridley trusted Stephen, respected his judgment, but it was also clear that he was worried about the potential consequences of showing mercy to a fugitive. "He'd have to surrender the stolen vehicle," Ridley said finally. "Plead guilty to the charges in Wyoming. Accept full responsibility and submit to regular supervision." "I understand," Damon said, though his heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear his own voice. "Do you?" Ridley stepped closer, his eyes boring into Damon's. "Because this isn't a game, son. You screw this up, and you'll be looking at serious prison time. And if those Nevada boys decide to make trouble while you're under my protection, a lot of good people could get hurt." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. Damon thought about running again, about the life he'd lived for 25 years, always moving, always looking over his shoulder, never allowing himself to care about anything or anyone because caring made you vulnerable. Then he thought about Zephyr's trust, about Stephen's quiet faith, about the satisfaction he'd found in honest work and the possibility of building something instead of just tearing things down. "I want to stay," he said, the words coming out stronger than he'd expected. "I want to try to make this right." Ridley nodded slowly. "All right then, but I'm giving you 24 hours to think about it. This is a big decision, and I want you to be sure. Once you sign those papers, there's no going back. You'll be committed to seeing this through, no matter what those Nevada boys throw at us." "I'm sure," Damon said. "We'll see," Ridley replied. "I'll be back tomorrow morning with the paperwork. If you change your mind, if you decide you'd rather take your chances on the road, you'd better be gone before I get here. Because after tomorrow, if you run, I'll hunt you down myself." As the sheriff drove away, leaving another cloud of dust hanging in the air, Damon felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. He'd made his choice, committed himself to a path he'd never imagined possible. But making the choice was just the beginning. Now he had to prove that he was worthy of the trust Stephen and Lila were placing in him. "You know this is crazy, right?" Lila said, joining him and Stephen in the yard. "Probably," Stephen agreed. "But sometimes crazy is exactly what's needed." Damon looked at the fence he'd helped repair, at the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture, at the mountains rising majestically in the distance. For the first time in his adult life, he was going to stop running. The question was whether he'd have the courage to face whatever came next. 24 hours, he said softly. 24 hours, Stephen agreed. Better make them count. The sun was setting behind the Wind River Range, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple when Damon found himself sitting alone on a wooden stump near the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the ranch. The water moved with a quiet persistence that reminded him of Stephen's manner, calm on the surface, but carrying an undeniable power. He'd been there for over an hour, wrestling with doubts that grew stronger as darkness approached. 24 hours. That's what Sheriff Ridley had given him to make the most important decision of his life. Stay and face whatever consequences came with it, or run and spend the rest of his existence looking over his shoulder. On paper, it should have been an easy choice. He was a survivor, had been all his life. Survivors ran when they had to, adapted when they could, and never let sentiment cloud their judgment. But sitting here in the gathering dusk, listening to the gentle murmur of the creek and the distant sound of horses moving in their pasture, Damon found himself thinking about things he tried not to think about for years. Like what it might feel like to have a place where he belonged. Like what it would be like to wake up in the same bed every morning instead of in a different motel room or the back seat of a stolen car. Like what it would mean to have people who cared whether he lived or died. Mind if I join you? Damon looked up to find Stephen approaching through the twilight, moving with that same quiet grace that marked all his actions. He was carrying 2 bottles of beer, condensation beating on the glass in the evening air. "It's your ranch," Damon said, accepting one of the bottles gratefully. "Actually, it's Lila's ranch," Stephen corrected, settling onto a fallen log nearby. "Her grandfather left it to her when he died. I just help out when she needs it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the distance, a coyote called from somewhere up in the hills, wild and lonesome, and Damon found himself wondering if the animal was alone by choice or circumstance. "I did some things," Stephen said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper, "during my years in the service. Black ops stuff, the kind of missions that don't officially exist. We told ourselves we were the good guys, that we were protecting innocent people from monsters. And maybe some of it was true. But there were times." He trailed off, taking a long pull from his beer. In the growing darkness, his face was difficult to read, but Damon could hear something in his voice that he recognized the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. "There was a mission in Somalia," Stephen continued. "We were supposed to extract a high-value target, someone who'd been selling weapons to terrorist groups. Clean in and out, minimal casualties. But the intel was wrong, and what we found was a family. Women, children, people who'd never hurt anyone in their lives." Damon felt his chest tighten. He'd heard stories like this before, usually in the kind of bars where men went to drink away memories they couldn't live with. "My team wanted to abort, call it off, and try again when we had better intelligence. But I was the ranking officer, and I was so focused on completing the mission, on proving I could handle the responsibility, that I ordered us to proceed. We told ourselves they were collateral damage, that sometimes innocents get caught in the crossfire. But that was just pretty words covering up an ugly truth." "What truth?" Damon asked softly. "That I was a coward," Stephen said simply. "Too afraid of failure to admit I'd made a mistake. Too proud to back down when backing down was the right thing to do. 3 children died that night because I chose my career over their lives." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Damon had seen Stephen in action, witnessed the calm competence with which he'd handled the attempted truck theft. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the broken man sitting beside him. "What did you do?" Damon asked. "I ran," Stephen said with a bitter laugh. "Oh, I finished out my tour, received commendations for successful completion of the mission. But inside, I was running as fast and hard as I could from what I'd done. Spent the next 15 years taking private contracts, telling myself I was putting my skills to good use protecting important people. But really, I was just trying to outrun the memory of those children's faces." "When did you stop running?" Stephen was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "When I realized I couldn't," he said finally. "The running wasn't taking me anywhere, just keeping me from dealing with what I'd done. So I came here, to this place where Lila's grandfather had taught me to fish when I was young, and I tried to figure out how to live with myself." "Did you?" "Figure it out, I mean. I'm still working on it," Stephen admitted. "But I learned something important. Redemption isn't a destination you reach by running far enough or fast enough. It's a choice you make every day, every moment. To be better than you were before. To use whatever time you have left to try to balance the scales." Damon thought about that, about the idea of redemption as a daily choice rather than a one-time transformation. It made sense in a way that the Hollywood version never had. Real change wasn't dramatic and sudden. It was slow and difficult and required constant vigilance. "Those men who are coming for me," Damon said, "they're not going to just give up. And when they get here, they're going to want blood. Mine specifically." "Probably," Stephen agreed. "But running won't change that. They'll keep coming, keep hunting, until they find you or until something stops them permanently. At least here, you won't be facing them alone. I can't ask you to fight my battles." "You're not asking," Stephen said simply. "I'm offering. And there's a difference." A rustling in the grass nearby announced Buck's approach, the old man, emerging from the shadows like a ghost materializing from the darkness. He was carrying a thermos and wore the kind of serious expression that suggested important business. "Coffee?" he said by way of greeting, unscrewing the cap and pouring the steaming liquid into the metal cup that served as a lid. Figured you might need some thinking fuel. Thanks, Damon said, accepting the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and black, with just a hint of sweetness that reminded him of the first cup Stephen had given him. Been doing some thinking myself, Buck continued, settling onto the ground with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen better days. About what you said yesterday, about making bad choices. Got me wondering what choices I made that led to losing my boy. The confession surprised Damon. Buck had seemed so certain in his condemnation, so sure that Damon represented everything wrong with the world. Started thinking about all the times I told Jake he wasn't good enough. Buck went on. All the times I was too busy with ranch work to listen when he wanted to talk. All the times I chose being right over being kind. Maybe if I'd been a better father, he wouldn't have ended up running with that gang in Denver. Buck, Stephen said gently, your son's death wasn't your fault. Maybe not, the old man agreed. But my failures as a father sure didn't help. Point is, we all got things we'd do different if we could. Question is what we do with the time we got left. They sat together in the darkness, three men bound by their shared understanding of regret and the possibility of redemption. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, but somehow comforting in their constancy. I spent my whole life running, Damon said finally. From foster homes, from juvenile detention, from any situation that got too complicated or demanded too much of me. But sitting here, thinking about tomorrow, I realize I'm tired of running. Tired of being alone. Tired of being afraid. Staying won't make you less afraid, Stephen warned. If anything, it might make you more afraid. Because now you'll have something to lose. I know, Damon said. But maybe that's the point. Maybe being afraid for the right reasons is better than being afraid for no reason at all. As if summoned by their conversation, Zephyr appeared at the fence line, his silver coat ghostly in the starlight. The horse nickered softly, a sound that carried across the distance like a question. He's asking if you're staying, Buck said, with a slight smile. Damon stood up, walking over to the fence where Zephyr waited. The horse allowed him to stroke his neck, leaning into the touch with the trust that still amazed him. Yeah, he said softly, speaking to the horse but meaning it for all of them. I'm staying. When Sheriff Ridley returned the next morning, with his paperwork, he found Damon waiting on the porch of the main house, dressed in clean clothes and wearing an expression of quiet determination. The stolen car sat in the driveway, keys on the dashboard, ready to be returned to its rightful owner. You sure about this? Ridley asked one last time. I'm sure, Damon replied, and for the first time in his life, he actually meant it. The weeks that followed Damon's decision to stay settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and comforting. Dawn came early to the ranch, and with it came work that demanded everything he had to give. His hands, once soft from city living, grew calloused and strong. His back, initially protesting the constant demands of physical labor, adapted and hardened. But more than his body was changing, something deeper was shifting inside him, something he couldn't quite name but felt in. Quiet moments like this one. He was under the hood of Buck's ancient Ford tractor, wrestling with a stubborn carburetor that had been giving them trouble for days. The engine bay was cramped and hot, and grease had long since worked its way under his fingernails and into the creases of his palms. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work, about diagnosing a problem and methodically working through the solution. Hand me that 3/4 wrench, he called to Buck, who was standing nearby with a toolbox and a skeptical expression. You sure you know what you're doing? Buck asked, though he passed over the requested tool without hesitation. I'm learning, Damon replied, feeling the carburetor finally give way under his careful pressure. Had to work on cars some in LA. Different from tractors, but engines are engines. Huh, Buck grunted, and Damon could hear the grudging approval in his voice. Well, I'll be damned. You're not half bad with a wrench. The compliment, simple as it was, hit Damon harder than he'd expected. When was the last time someone had praised his work? When was the last time he'd felt pride in something he'd accomplished with his own hands? Heat rose in his cheeks, and he ducked his head back under the hood to hide his embarrassment. Just need to clean the jets and reassemble, he said, his voice slightly muffled by the engine compartment. Should run like new after that. Working on the ranch had given him a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Every morning brought new challenges: fences to mend, animals to tend, equipment to repair. But unlike his previous life, where problems were solved through intimidation or violence, here the solutions required patience, skill, and an understanding that some things couldn't be rushed. He'd even started helping Stephen with the martial arts classes he taught to local kids in the converted shed behind the barn. At first, Damon had been reluctant to get involved, worried that his presence might contaminate something pure and good. But Stephen had insisted, and gradually, Damon found himself teaching basic boxing techniques to boys who reminded him of his younger self, angry, directionless, looking for something to believe in. "Keep your guard up, Tommy," he said to a 12-year-old, with a split lip and defiant eyes. "And remember, power comes from your legs, not your arms. You're not trying to hurt anyone. You're trying to protect yourself." The boy nodded seriously, adjusting his stance according to Damon's instructions. These kids came from difficult backgrounds, broken homes, poverty, the kind of circumstances that could easily lead them down the same path Damon had traveled. But here, in this converted shed with its heavy bags and worn mats, they were learning something different. They were learning that strength could be controlled, that power could be used to protect rather than destroy. "Good," Damon said, watching Tommy work through the combination they'd been practicing. "Now remember, the best fight is the one you don't have to have. These techniques are for when you don't have any other choice." It was a lesson he wished someone had taught him at Tommy's age. Maybe if he'd learned that violence was a last resort rather than a first option, his life would have taken a different path. But that was the past, and dwelling on it served no purpose. All he could do was try to give these kids the guidance he'd never received. The afternoon brought a different kind of work. One of the Mares had gotten spooked by something in the pasture and was threatening to bolt into the fence. Lila was trying to calm her, speaking in low, soothing tones, but the animal was too frightened to listen. Without thinking, Damon moved to intercept the mare, placing himself between the horse and the fence, his arms spread wide to create a barrier. "Easy, girl," he said softly, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd heard Stephen use. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The mare reared up, her hooves flashing dangerously close to his head, but Damon didn't flinch. He'd learned to read the animal's body language, to distinguish between genuine aggression and fear-driven panic. This mare wasn't trying to hurt him. She was just scared and looking for a way out. "That's it," he continued, slowly closing the distance between them. "You're okay. Nobody's going to hurt you." Gradually, the mare's panic subsided, and she allowed Damon to approach. He stroked her neck gently, feeling the tension leave her muscles as she realized she was safe. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous to him. "Nice work," Lila said, and when Damon looked at her, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not just appreciation, but genuine warmth. For the first time since he'd arrived, she was looking at him like he belonged here. But even as he was finding his place on the ranch, developing skills he'd never known he possessed, and earning the respect of people he'd come to care about, the past was never far away. It came roaring back into focus one evening when Stephen returned from town with a grim expression and news that made Damon's blood run cold. "Sheriff called," Stephen said without preamble. "There's been some men asking questions around town. Professional types from Nevada. They've been showing your picture around, asking if anyone's seen you." The words hit Damon like a physical blow. He'd known this moment would come, had been preparing for it mentally for weeks, but that didn't make it any easier to face. The hunters had found his trail, and now they were closing in. "How long?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Not long," Stephen replied. "Maybe a day, maybe two. They're being careful, trying not to attract too much attention, but they're definitely getting closer." Damon felt the familiar urge to run, to grab what few possessions he'd accumulated and disappear into the night. It would be easy enough to steal another car, to put hundreds of miles between himself and the ranch before anyone realized he was gone. But the thought of leaving now, of abandoning the life he'd just begun to build, filled him with a grief so sharp it took his breath away. "I should go," he said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew he didn't mean them. "Should you?" Stephen asked quietly. "Or should you stay and face whatever's coming?" Before Damon could answer, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything Stephen had taught him about choosing the harder path, about standing ground instead of running, about the difference between surviving and living. "You're not alone in this," Stephen said simply. "Whatever happens, you're not alone." For the first time since Vegas, Damon felt something that might have been hope. Not the desperate hope of a man grasping at straws, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're not facing the darkness alone. He'd spent his whole life running from his problems, but maybe it was time to stand and fight. "Okay," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Okay, I'll stay. But when they come, when this gets ugly, I want you to promise me something." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll protect Lila and Buck. Whatever happens to me, don't let them get hurt because of my choices." Stephen's grip on his shoulder tightened. "I promise," he said. "But you're missing the point. We're not just protecting them from your past. We're protecting you from it too. Because you're family now, whether you believe it or not." As they stood there in the gathering dusk, Damon felt something he'd never experienced before. The knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. Whatever came next, whatever price he had to pay for his past mistakes, he would face it here, on this ranch, with these people who had somehow become his family. The hunters were coming, but for the first time in his life, Damon wasn't running to meet them. The black sedan came up the ranch road just as the sun was setting behind the Wind River Range, its dark windows reflecting the last golden light of day like predatory eyes. Damon watched it approach from the barn where he'd been grooming Zephyr, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd known this moment would come, had been preparing for it mentally for days, but seeing the car actually materialize made everything suddenly, terrifyingly real. Stephen emerged from the house, moving with that characteristic calm that had become so familiar over the past weeks. He wasn't carrying any visible weapons, but there was something in his posture, in the way he held his shoulders, that suggested he was ready for whatever came next. Behind him, Lila appeared on the porch, her face pale but determined, while Buck positioned himself near the barn with the kind of casual alertness that spoke of a man who'd seen his share of trouble. The sedan stopped 20 feet from the house, and two men got out. They were exactly what Damon had expected: expensive suits, dark sunglasses, the kind of cold professionalism that marked them as serious operators. The driver was tall and lean, with the build of a man who stayed in shape for his work. His passenger was shorter but broader, with hands that looked like they'd broken their share of bones. Both moved with the easy confidence of men who were used to getting what they wanted. "Afternoon," the tall one said, his voice carrying just a hint of East Coast accent. "We're looking for a man named Damon Cruz. We have reason to believe he might be in this area." "And you are?" Stephen asked, his tone polite but not welcoming. "We represent certain business interests in Nevada," the man replied, reaching into his jacket to produce a leather wallet. "Mr. Cruz has something that belongs to our employers. We're here to collect it." Damon stepped out of the barn, Zephyr following behind him like a silver shadow. The horse seemed to sense the tension in the air, his ears flicking back and forth, his nostrils flaring as he tested the scent of the strangers. There was something almost supernatural about the animal's presence, as if he understood that this was a moment of reckoning and had chosen to stand witness. "I'm Damon Cruz," he said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "What do you want?" The tall man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged on a shark. "Mr. Cruz, you've been a very difficult man to find. Our employers are not pleased with the inconvenience you've caused them." "I don't have their money," Damon replied. "If that's what this is about, I can't give them what I don't have." "Oh, this isn't about money," the shorter man said, speaking for the first time. His voice was rough, like gravel in a cement mixer, and when he smiled, Damon could see gold teeth gleaming in the fading light. "This is about respect, about consequences, about making sure other people understand what happens when you cross our employers." Damon felt his chest tighten. He'd hoped, somehow, that this might be about money, about restitution for the job that had gone wrong. Money could be negotiated, worked out over time. But respect, consequences, making examples, those were things that usually required blood. "How much?" he asked desperately. "Whatever they think I cost them, I'll pay it back. I've got work here, steady work. I can make payments." The tall man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about making you whole. This is about making you gone. Permanently." That's when Stephen stepped forward, and something in the way he moved made both men tense. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't making any threatening gestures, but there was something about his presence that filled the space between them like a gathering storm. "I think you gentlemen have made a mistake," Stephen said quietly. "This is private property, and Mr. Cruz is under the protection of local law enforcement. I suggest you leave now, before this becomes a legal matter." The shorter man laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down Damon's spine. "Legal matter? Old man, do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Our employers have judges on payroll, cops in their pockets, and enough lawyers to paper this entire county. Your local law enforcement can't protect him from us." "Maybe not," Stephen agreed. "But I can." The two men exchanged glances, and Damon could see them reassessing the situation. Stephen didn't look like much a middle-aged rancher in worn jeans and a faded denim shirt. But something about the way he carried himself, the absolute certainty in his voice, made them pause. "You're making a mistake, friend," the tall man said, his hand moving inside his jacket. "This isn't your fight." "Actually," Stephen replied, "it is. Because Mr. Cruz is family now, and I protect my family." The shorter man's hand was moving toward his waistband when Lila's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said from the porch. The pump-action shotgun in her hands was pointed directly at the center of his chest, and her finger was definitely on the trigger this time. "We've had problems with coyotes lately. Sheriff won't ask too many questions about what happened to a couple of varmints who wandered onto our property after dark." The two men found themselves in a position no professional wanted to be in, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing opponents who clearly weren't going to be intimidated. The tall man's hand slowly moved away from his jacket, while his partner raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This isn't over," the tall man said, his voice carrying the promise of future violence. "Our employers don't give up easily. You can't watch him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Eventually, you'll slip up, and when you do, we'll be there." "Maybe," Stephen said calmly. "But not today, and not on my land. I suggest you get back in your car and drive away. Now." The two men retreated to their sedan, but not before the shorter one fixed Damon with a look that promised pain and suffering. As they drove away, their taillights disappearing into the gathering darkness, Damon felt his legs give out, and he sank down onto a bale of hay, his whole body shaking with reaction. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry I brought this down on you." Lila crossed the yard and sat down beside him, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. "You didn't bring anything down on us," she said firmly. "We chose to stand with you. There's a difference." "They'll be back," Damon said, looking up at Stephen. "You know they will. This isn't over." "No," Stephen agreed. "It's not. But for the first time since you got here, you didn't run. You stood your ground, faced them down, and let them know you weren't afraid." "I was terrified," Damon admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid," Stephen said. "It means doing what's right even when you are afraid. Today, you chose to stay and fight instead of running. That's the most courageous thing you've ever done." That night, Damon found himself by the fence again, Zephyr at his side. The horse nuzzled his shoulder with gentle insistence, as if trying to offer comfort in the only way he knew how. In the distance, he could hear the sound of Stephen and Buck making their rounds, checking the security of the ranch, preparing for whatever might come next. "You know what the funny thing is?" Damon said to the horse. "For the first time in my life, I'm not thinking about running. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. I'm thinking about staying." Zephyr snorted softly, and Damon could have sworn he heard approval in the sound. The horse had spent years running wild in the mountains, surviving on his own, trusting no one. But eventually, he'd found something worth stopping for, something worth the risk of vulnerability. Stephen appeared out of the darkness, moving with his characteristic quiet grace. "How are you holding up?" he asked, joining Damon at the fence. "Better than I expected," Damon said truthfully. "I keep waiting for the fear to hit, for the panic to set in. But all I feel is calm, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "That's because you are," Stephen said simply. "You found your place, Damon. The question now is whether you're going to keep it." "I'm going to try," Damon said. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm going to try." Stephen smiled. And for the first time since Damon had known him, it was a smile without reservation, without the weight of judgment or uncertainty. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not because you were willing to fight today, but because you chose not to run. That took more courage than any battle ever could." As they stood there in the darkness, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, Damon felt something he'd never experienced before: the deep, abiding peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The men from Nevada would return eventually, and when they did, he would face them. But he would face them here, on this ranch, with these people who had become his family. The running was over. The standing still had begun. Epilogue: 6 months later, Damon Cruz rode Zephyr across the eastern pasture as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. The silver Mustang moved beneath him with the fluid grace of an animal completely at peace with his rider, their partnership a testament to the power of trust and patience. The ranch spread out before them like a promise fulfilled, fences mended and strong, horses healthy and content, the main house warm with the light of family gathered around the dinner table. Damon's probation officer had been by the week before, marveling at the transformation of a man who'd once been considered irredeemable. The men from Nevada had never returned, whether from wisdom or other commitments. Damon neither knew nor cared. Sheriff Ridley had mentioned rumors of federal investigations, of certain business interests in Las Vegas finding themselves under increased scrutiny, but that was the past. This was the present: a man, a horse, and the endless sky of Wyoming. Morning. As Zephyr crested a small hill, Damon could see Stephen and Lila working together to repair a gate, their easy cooperation speaking of a relationship that had found its way back to something resembling love. Buck was visible in the distance, teaching a group of local kids the finer points of horse care, his gruff exterior unable to hide the gentle patience beneath. "One choice at a time," Damon said softly, echoing the words Stephen had spoken to him so many months ago. "One day at a time." Zephyr nickered in response, and together they rode toward home, toward the life that had chosen them as surely as they had chosen it. The once fugitive and the once wild horse, both finally at peace with standing still. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.